The Scene That Lied. The call came in at high May a.m., slicing through the fragile quiet of Portland like a blade through skin. Detective Ethan Cole had learned to recognize that hour. Too late for coincidence, too early for mercy. Death preferred the night. It always had. He arrived on Willow Street 20 minutes later. Red and blue lights pulsed against the brick walls of a modest apartment building, washing the street in alternating colors that made everything feel unreal, like a scene staged for someone else's nightmare. The crowd was small, neighbors in pajamas, a woman clutching a robe too tightly around her body, a man pretending to scroll on his phone while staring far too long at the police tape. Apartment 3B was on the second floor. Ethan climbed the steps slowly. He always did. Rushing into a crime scene was the fastest way to miss something that mattered. The door stood open, no forced entry. Inside, the apartment was neat, too neat. A couch aligned carefully with the coffee table, a folded blanket resting on the armrest, a single mug in the sink, rinsed but not washed. Someone had intended to clean later. The bedroom was at the end of the narrow hallway. Laura Mitchell lay on the floor just inside it. She was barefoot. One sock still clung to her left foot, the other missing. Her right hand was stretched toward the doorway, fingers curled slightly, as if she had been reaching for something she never quite touched. Her eyes were open. People always noticed the eyes first. One stab wound. Clean. Center mass. No hesitation marks. No wild slashing. Whoever did this hadn't panicked. Not at first. Uniformed officers murmured quietly near the doorway, careful not to step too close. Ethan raised a hand, signaling them to give him space. He crouched, scanning the floor, the bed, the nightstand. Then his gaze drifted to the wall beside the door, and he stopped breathing. The blood mark was small, a thin vertical streak no longer than 6 inches, darkened to a deep brown at the edges where it had begun to dry. It didn't splatter. It didn't drip. It dragged. Someone had pressed their hand against the wall. "Photograph that," Ethan said quietly. The crime scene photographer nodded, already adjusting her lens. Ethan stood and studied the wall from different angles. The height of the mark suggested someone standing upright. The direction suggested pressure, not collapse. This wasn't the victim's blood. He felt it instantly. Laura Mitchell's blood was pooled on the floor beneath her, spreading outward in a dark halo. The wall mark sat too high, too clean. Someone else had bled here. The official report that morning leaned toward a robbery gone wrong. Laura's phone was missing. Her wallet was gone. Her laptop remained on the desk, untouched. The door had not been forced. It was the kind of case that solved itself if you let it. Ethan never let cases do that. Laura's life unfolded quickly in the files spread across his desk later that day. 29 years old, freelance graphic designer, no criminal record, no known enemies. Her social media was tame. Photos of coffee shops, sunsets, the occasional sarcastic caption about deadlines. One detail stood out. Daniel Brooks. Ex-boyfriend. Relationship ended 6 months ago. According to friends, it was amicable. According to neighbors, Daniel's car had been seen on Willow Street more than once since the breakup. Ethan requested Daniel be brought in for questioning. Daniel arrived at the station just after noon. He walked in like a man who believed he had nothing to hide. Tall, broad shoulders, clean-shaven, dark hair cut short. He wore jeans and a jacket that looked new enough to suggest he cared how he appeared. Ethan noticed the bandage on his right palm immediately. Daniel noticed him noticing it. They sat across from each other in interview room B. The glass reflected Daniel's face faintly, like a second, quieter version watching from behind. "I'm sorry about Laura," Daniel said. "She didn't deserve this." His voice was steady, measured. "Tell me about last night," Ethan replied. Daniel said Laura had called him earlier that evening, said she wanted to talk. Closure. He arrived around 8:15 p.m. They argued. He admitted that much. But nothing physical, he insisted. He left before 9. "She was alive when I left," Daniel said. Ethan nodded. "Your hand?" Daniel glanced down. "Work accident, broken glass at the warehouse." Ethan made a note. He didn't challenge it yet. Forensics took longer. They always did. But when Dr. Rachel Moore called, her tone was sharp with certainty. "The blood on the wall? Male, not the victim. Pattern suggests pressure from a palm. We've pulled DNA." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Match?" he asked. "Pending," Rachel replied. "But Ethan, I don't think this is a robbery." Neither did he. Daniel was brought back in that evening. This time, it wasn't routine. The interrogation room was colder now, the kind of cold that crept into your bones and made your thoughts slow and heavy. Ethan placed a photograph on the table, the blood mark. Daniel stared at it longer than before. That blood isn't Laura's, Ethan said. It's yours. Daniel scoffed. You don't know that. We do. Daniel's jaw tightened. His confidence wavered, just slightly. Enough. She told you something that night, Ethan continued. Something you didn't want to hear. Silence. She was moving on, Ethan said. Wasn't she? Um, Daniel's hands curled into fists beneath the table. She didn't need you anymore. Daniel looked up, eyes burning. You don't know what you're talking about, Word. Ethan, explain why your blood is on her wall. Daniel stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. Officers moved instantly, hands ready. Sit down, Ethan said calmly. Daniel did. Minutes passed. Then Daniel's shoulders sagged. She said she was seeing someone else, he muttered. The words spilled slowly after that. Laura had tried to leave the room. He grabbed her arm. She fought back. The knife had been there. He didn't remember picking it up. Only the heat, the shock, the silence afterward. I leaned on the wall, Daniel whispered. I didn't even notice I was bleeding. Ethan said nothing. Some confessions didn't need encouragement. Daniel Brooks was arrested that night and charged with second-degree murder. As Ethan left the station hours later, the image of that thin blood mark lingered in his mind. What the wall didn't say. The city moved on faster than it should have. By the second morning after Laura Mitchell's death, Willow Street looked ordinary again. The police tape was gone. The neighbors returned to their routines. The apartment door of 3B stood closed, silent, as if the violence inside had been nothing more than a bad dream. Ethan Cole knew better. Cases like this didn't end with an arrest. They only changed shape. Daniel Brooks sat alone in a holding cell while the system began its slow, grinding process. His confession had been recorded. His fingerprints were logged. His DNA would soon confirm what the blood on the wall already knew. But Ethan wasn't satisfied. He never was. Confessions lied too. Sometimes people confessed to things they didn't fully understand. Sometimes they confessed to less than they had done, and sometimes they told the truth, but not the whole of it. Ethan returned to the case files, reading Laura Mitchell's life backward, searching for fractures that hadn't been obvious at first glance. He listened again to interviews with her friends. Most described her as kind, conflict avoidant, someone who hated confrontation. One detail surfaced repeatedly. She was scared of disappointing people. Fear made people stay longer than they should. Fear made them answer calls they shouldn't have answered. Ethan requested phone records. Laura had called Daniel at 7:42 p.m. the night she died. The call lasted nearly 12 minutes, long enough to argue, long enough to hesitate, long enough to agree to something she didn't want. Daniel claimed she invited him over. The records didn't say that. They only said she called. When Ethan visited Daniel again, the man looked different, smaller. The bravado had drained from him overnight, leaving behind a hollowed-out version of the man who had walked into interview room B with his shoulders squared. Daniel stared at the table as Ethan sat across from him. You said Laura wanted closure, Ethan began. What did that mean to you? Daniel swallowed. It meant an ending, or a restart, Daniel flinched. She said she was seeing someone, Ethan continued. But you still went over. She asked me to, Daniel snapped, then stopped himself. I mean, she didn't ask, not directly. What did she say? Daniel hesitated. She said she was tired of things being unfinished. That wasn't an invitation. That was guilt. Ethan leaned back. You didn't go there to talk, Daniel. You went there hoping she'd change her mind. Daniel's silence confirmed it. The forensic report arrived later that afternoon. The DNA from the blood on the wall matched Daniel Brooks conclusively. The angle of the smear suggested pressure from a right hand. The cut on Daniel's palm was consistent with contact from the knife recovered at the scene. Everything lined up. Almost everything. Ethan couldn't shake one detail. Laura's body position suggested she had been moving away from Daniel when she was stabbed, not toward him. The wound angle was slightly upward, as if delivered while she was turning. That wasn't rage. That was panic. He returned to apartment 3B with a forensic reconstruction specialist. Together, they walked through the apartment slowly, mapping movement, imagining momentum. Laura's bare feet suggested she had been relaxed initially. comfortable. Then something changed. Her missing sock was later found near the couch. She had tried to leave the apartment. The knife had come from the kitchen. That meant Daniel had followed her out of the bedroom, grabbed the knife, then returned. Or Laura had run past the kitchen. Either way, there was more movement than Daniel had admitted. Ethan stared again at the wall where the blood mark had been. Someone had leaned there after the stab. But why stay? Why not flee immediately? Unless something had stopped him. Ethan checked the neighbor's statements again. One woman, Mrs. Hanley in apartment 3A, mentioned hearing voices around 8:45 p.m. Raised voices. A woman crying. Then silence. She hadn't reported it at the time. Arguments happened. She didn't want to be involved. Ethan wondered how many crimes survived because of that sentence. He visited Daniel's workplace next. The warehouse was loud and impersonal, stacked high with boxes and forklifts. Daniel's supervisor confirmed the cut on Daniel's hand had not happened at work. There had been no incident involving broken glass that week. Another lie. Ethan pressed deeper, digging into Daniel's past. No criminal record, but a pattern emerged. Daniel had a history of intense relationships. Former partners described him as controlling, emotional, hard to let go. One woman said something that stayed with Ethan. "He didn't hit me," she said. "He didn't have to. He made you feel like leaving would destroy him." That kind of pressure was quieter than violence, but no less dangerous. Back at the station, Ethan reviewed the interrogation footage again. Daniel's confession was emotional, but oddly restrained. He spoke of the moment of violence, but not what came before it. So Ethan returned to the cell one last time. Daniel looked up slowly as Ethan approached. "You said you lost control," Ethan said, "but you also said you didn't mean to hurt her." Daniel nodded. "Those two things don't cancel each other out," Ethan said. "One explains the other." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "I loved her." "You wanted to own her," Ethan replied. The words hit harder than any accusation. Daniel's voice broke. He admitted that Laura had tried to end the conversation, that she told him she was afraid of him that night, that she said she wanted him to leave. That was when he grabbed her arm. The knife hadn't been an accident. Not entirely. He hadn't planned it, but he had chosen it. "I just wanted her to stay," Daniel whispered. Ethan stood. That was enough. The district attorney prepared the case carefully. Second-degree murder, no plea deal, the blood evidence, the confession, the behavioral pattern, all of it would tell a story the jury couldn't ignore. The media latched onto the case quickly. Headlines focused on the blood mark on the wall. "Small detail solves brutal murder," one headline read. They liked the simplicity of it. A single clue, a single truth. Ethan knew better. It was never just one thing. It was the phone call she shouldn't have made, the door she shouldn't have opened, the moment she tried to leave, the moment he refused to let her. The wall didn't just record blood, it recorded hesitation. Weeks later, Ethan stood in the empty apartment again. The wall had been repainted, the stain erased, but the outline lingered faintly beneath the new coat, visible only if you knew where to look. Something's never disappeared completely. Ethan left, closing the door behind him. Outside, Willow Street carried on. Inside the system, Daniel Brooks waited for trial. And in the quiet space between guilt and justice, the truth continued to echo. Soft, persistent, impossible to ignore. The trial of silence. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and recycled air, a sterile kind of gravity that pressed down on everyone who entered. It was the sort of place where truth was expected to behave, where it was forced into clean sentences and yes or no answers, stripped of its messiness and pain. Daniel Brooks sat at the defense table in a dark suit that didn't quite fit him. He had lost weight in the months since his arrest. His cheeks were hollow now, his eyes shadowed. He kept his hands folded tightly in front of him, the faint scar on his right palm barely visible beneath the sleeve. Laura Mitchell's parents sat in the second row, holding each other's hands. They didn't look at Daniel. They stared straight ahead, as if turning their heads even slightly might cause them to shatter. Detective Ethan Cole took his seat behind the prosecution, legal pad resting on his knee. He had testified dozens of times before, but this case sat heavier than most. Maybe because it wasn't about some faceless criminal or a life steeped in violence. Maybe because it was about something smaller, quieter, and far more familiar. The jury filed in, 12 strangers tasked with dissecting the worst moment of two lives. The prosecution opened with the facts, the timeline, the blood, the confession. They spoke clearly, deliberately, as if laying out pieces of a puzzle that only fit one way. Laura Mitchell was alive. Daniel Brooks arrived. An argument escalated. A knife was used. Laura Mitchell died. Simple. The defense's opening statement told a different story. They spoke of heartbreak, of emotional volatility, of a man pushed beyond reason by rejection. They described Daniel as someone who had made a terrible mistake in the heat of the moment, not a calculated killer. They emphasized the absence of prior violence, the lack of premeditation, the clean nature of the wound. This was not murder, the defense attorney said. This was a tragic accident fueled by overwhelming emotion. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. Accidents didn't leave lies behind. Witnesses were called one by one. Laura's friends spoke of her kindness, her reluctance to confront, her tendency to minimize her own discomfort for the sake of others. One friend broke down while describing a text Laura had sent weeks before her death. "He won't stop checking in," Laura had written. "I don't want to be mean, but I don't know how to tell him to let go." The defense objected. The judge allowed it. Dr. Rachel Moore took the stand next. She explained the blood evidence carefully, clinically. She described the palm smear on the wall, the DNA match, the angle, the pressure. She explained how the blood had not spattered, how it had been transferred deliberately by contact. This blood did not belong to the victim, she said. It belonged to the defendant. The defense attempted to undermine her certainty, suggesting contamination, secondary transfer, coincidence. Rachel did not waver. Science rarely did. Then it was Ethan's turn. He took the stand, sworn in, posture straight. He spoke of the crime scene, the absence of forced entry, the missing items staged to resemble a robbery. He described Daniel's initial statement, the cut on his hand, the inconsistencies. When the prosecutor asked about the blood mark, Ethan paused. "It was small," he said, "easy to miss, but it didn't behave like an accident. It behaved like someone stopping themselves, someone realizing what they'd done." The defense attorney approached slowly during cross-examination. "Detective Cole," he said, "isn't it true that intense emotional distress can impair judgment?" "Yes." "And isn't it possible that Mr. Brooks acted without intent to kill?" Ethan met his gaze. "It's possible he didn't plan it. It's not possible that he didn't choose it." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The defense pressed harder, suggesting Laura may have startled Daniel, that the knife may have slipped, that the wound could have been unintended. Ethan answered carefully, truthfully. "Intent isn't only about planning," he said. "It's about actions taken when a choice still exists." Daniel took the stand on the fourth day. The courtroom fell silent as he swore to tell the truth. He spoke of love, of loss, of feeling replaced. He cried openly when he described Laura telling him she was afraid of him. He said the word afraid like it surprised him, like it had only just occurred to him how bad things had become. "I didn't want to hurt her," Daniel said. "I just wanted her to stay." The prosecutor stood slowly. "Did Laura ask you to come over that night?" Daniel hesitated. She didn't tell me not to." "That's not what I asked," the prosecutor said. "No," Daniel admitted. "She didn't ask me to come. And when she tried to leave the room, I panicked. And when you followed her into the kitchen, I don't remember." "But you remember picking up the knife?" Daniel swallowed. "Yes." "And you remember leaning against the wall afterward?" "Yes." The prosecutor nodded. No further questions. Closing arguments stretched into the afternoon. The defense urged the jury to see Daniel as human, flawed, overwhelmed. The prosecution urged them to see Laura, her fear, her attempt to leave, her final choice being taken from her. When the jury retired to deliberate, the room exhaled collectively. Ethan waited. Hours passed. Finally, the jury returned. The foreperson stood. "On the charge of second-degree murder," she said, "we find the defendant guilty." Laura's mother let out a sound that was half sob, half breath. Daniel closed his eyes. His shoulders slumped as if the verdict had physically weighed him down. Sentencing was scheduled for later. Daniel would face decades in prison. As the courtroom emptied, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer. He watched the space where Laura had never been able to sit, the space where her voice would never be heard. Justice had been served, but it felt incomplete. Outside, reporters clustered, microphones raised. Ethan pushed past them, stepping into the cool air. He didn't stop walking until he reached his car. That night, he dreamed of the wall. Not the blood, but the moment before it. The second where everything could have gone differently. The second that never made it into testimony. Some truths didn't fit inside a courtroom. They lived in the silence between words. What remains? Sentencing came 6 weeks later, on a gray morning that felt heavier than it should have. The courtroom was quieter this time. No arguments, no objections, just consequences. Daniel Brooks stood when the judge entered, hands clasped in front of him, eyes fixed on a spot just above the bench. He had stopped looking at people somewhere between the verdict and now. It was easier that way. Faces asked questions he no longer knew how to answer. The judge spoke calmly, methodically, as if reading from a manual designed to translate tragedy into numbers. Years. Eligibility. Conditions. The words settled into the room one by one. 32 years. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath for months. Laura Mitchell's parents were given the opportunity to speak. Her father stood first. His voice was steady, but his hands shook. "My daughter trusted people," he said. "She believed kindness was enough. It wasn't, and now she's gone." Her mother couldn't bring herself to stand. She spoke from her seat, voice barely above a whisper. She tried to leave, she said, and she wasn't allowed to. Daniel's head dipped lower. When it was his turn, he hesitated. The courtroom waited. "I think about that wall every day," he said finally. "I think about the moment I leaned against it. I think about how that's where I stopped, and she didn't." No apology could reach far enough. The judge sentenced him without embellishment. The gavel fell softly. It sounded final anyway. Outside the courthouse, life resumed with disturbing speed. Cars passed, phones rang, people laughed too loudly at a cafe across the street. Ethan Cole stood near the steps, watching Daniel being led into a transport vehicle. He felt no satisfaction, only a dull, familiar ache. Justice didn't heal, it only closed doors. Weeks turned into months. The apartment on Willow Street was rented again. New tenants, new furniture, new coats of paint layered thickly over old memories. The wall where the blood mark had been was white now, clean, innocent looking. But paint was never perfect. Under certain light, if you knew where to look, a faint unevenness remained, a ghost of pressure, a place where something had once pressed too hard. Ethan visited once, months later, under the pretense of checking paperwork. The new tenant had no idea what had happened there. Ethan didn't tell her. Some truths weren't meant to be shared. Daniel Brooks adjusted poorly to prison. The first nights were the worst. The silence wasn't quiet, it was loud, filled with echoes of memory. He replayed the argument endlessly, searching for a moment he could undo. He always landed on the same one. The instant Laura turned away, the instant he decided he couldn't let that be the end. In prison therapy sessions, he spoke about anger, abandonment, fear. The counselor listened without judgment, writing notes Daniel would never read. Understanding came slowly, painfully. "You didn't lose control," the counselor told him once. "You chose control over her." The words stayed with him longer than the bars. Years passed. Ethan Cole continued working cases, new victims, new suspects, new walls, but none left the same mark. Every time he entered a crime scene, his eyes drifted automatically to the walls. He looked for small things now, subtle things, places where someone had paused instead of fled, places where the truth had brushed against the surface and stayed there. Laura Mitchell's case became a teaching example in the department, not because it was sensational, but because it was quiet, because it showed how violence didn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived disguised as love. Sometimes it waited patiently for a moment of weakness. Ethan lectured new detectives about it. "Don't trust the obvious," he told them. "The truth rarely wants attention." On the 10th anniversary of Laura's death, Ethan returned to Willow Street one last time. The building looked older now. The tree out front had grown taller, its branches stretching over the sidewalk like a protective arch. He stood across the street, hands in his coat pockets, and watched the windows. Someone laughed inside apartment 3B. It didn't feel wrong. Laura had been more than the way she died. She deserved to be remembered as someone who lived. Ethan turned away and walked back to his car. In prison, Daniel Brooks marked the anniversary alone. He didn't ask for visitors. He didn't write letters. He sat on his bunk and traced the faint scar on his palm with his thumb. He thought about the wall, not the blood, not the evidence, the moment before, the second when he could have let go. That was the punishment that never ended. Somewhere between steel bars and memory, Daniel finally understood what the wall had known all along. Violence always left a mark,